Theoretical Times, a podcast series between Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to this next podcast on Theoretical Times. And as listeners know, we've moved to the next stage of the Theoretical Times project. We've moved from theorists and we're now looking at concepts. And our second concept is bunker anthropology. So this session in many ways is our methods session that we're going to explore, concept as method. But Steve, let's start with the definitional question, and indeed the question of the object rather than the concept. Why have you been drawn to the bunker?
That's a very good question. Bunker anthropology is my methods area for the Claustropolitan Sociology project. So it complements Claustropolitan Sociology, which we talked about in an earlier podcast, in terms of methods. So I am interested in using an idea which I picked up from Paul Virilio, which is around the bunkers, and particularly his idea of bunker archaeology, which we'll talk about in a minute. Paul Virilio actually started as a stained glass maker with Braque and Matisse, and this was in the 1950s, and he got particularly interested in photography. And one of the things he photographed was the whole series of bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, which were meant to keep the Allies out of France. And Virilio actually did some crazy things. He actually swam out to some of these bunkers, but he was interested basically in an archival photographic project, which you can see in his book, Bunker Archaeology. And I got particularly interested in what Virilio was trying to do with archive, but also because of his actual personal claustrophobia, I also got interested in this, the movement of the bunkers, which was what he was interested in to some extent. He built a whole archaeology and a whole architecture, actually, on the bunkers. And I did some work when we were at the University of Brighton around the Napoleonic forts in England, which I saw as like bunkers, really. It was like a pre-bunker archaeology. Anyway, so there was a lot of inspiration around these things, but I wasn't trying to replicate what Virilio did, and because of the sort of artistic background he came from, he wasn't a social theorist at all, although we kind of lump him in with the social theorists. Actually, I had to sort of start to think of what methods and what methodology I was really interested in this re-energising of sociology. And I called it bunker anthropology, and it came initially from Virilio's ideas around the bunker.
But what I find odd and also interesting about the bunker that we haven't teased out yet is the bunker, in the Virillian sense, was involved in surveillance, and in some ways it was almost a prison for ideas. So how are you handling the surveillance element, the violence, the warlike element within the bunker?
Yes, that's something that I was interested in Virilio's ideas about military technology, certainly, and about the speed of military technology, which then gets you into, how did video come about, how did the internet come about, and so on. I think he's very good on things like that. And he was certainly always interested in war, what he called pure war. Mm. But I think the technology side of it is interesting, certainly the technology aspect and surveillance, but I didn't really go into that very much. I kind of veered off towards this idea, which I'll explain later, which was really to do with emphasising particular methods, not necessarily methods that Virilio was interested in, although the archive aspect of it I was very interested in.
Indeed. So I just think listeners should carry forward as a Derridean trace, if you like, the notion that the bunker was involved in war. And I don't think we can lose that so easily, particularly with Virilio's deployment in military colleges in particular. So I think we need to remember that. But let's now move on to that disciplinary question. Bunker archaeology, of course, comes from Virilio, and it may seem more appropriate than bunker anthropology, because archaeology is about the structures, the building, the architecture, if you like, the history of the architecture. Why are you focusing on bunker anthropology rather than archaeology?
Well, you're absolutely right that the original term was Virilio's bunker archaeology, and that's what he called it. And
yes.
It's an extremely interesting book, which has a new version not long ago, which really is well worth reading for all sorts of reasons I'm looking at, because there's a huge number of images which actually Virilio took. But what I was interested in, it was partly a kind of ironic parody of bunker archaeology, which I moved on to when I talked about bunker anthropology. But I am interested in anthropology in social science. And I think particularly what I'm interested in, and I have been interested in for a long time, is ethnography and participant observation as a method. That's not to say that's the prime method, but it's a method which I think is extremely important to revive. And alongside archive, oral history, and indeed in-depth interviews and so on, a lot of the work that I've been doing most recently is around that. And I would argue that we have to re-emphasise particular methods and methodologies. So in This Sporting Life is Going to Be the Death of Me, which is the most recent book that I wrote, there's a great deal of work on football hooligan gangs, for example, which I started a number of years ago, and it was particularly around the football hooligan memoir that we concentrated. So the research team combined methods like ethnography, participant observation, archive, in-depth interview, oral history, and so on. Partly because I wanted to re-emphasise those. When I started the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture, a long time ago now with Derek Wynne, we actually went for postgraduate students who were interested in ethnography. We were trying to concentrate our minds on particularly club cultures and subcultures and football cultures and so on. And we wanted students who were interested in developing ethnographic methods.
Yeah.
So anthropology is extremely important in this history, if you like. But I've become absolutely certain with the work on claustrophobia and sociology that emphasis on methods like ethnography are really, really important. And criminologists like Steve Hall and Simon Winlow are with me on this. They emphasise ethnography, for example, in their work on ultra-realist criminology. So I was interested in developing projects which had these methods emphasised. So, for example, in the football hooligan memoir work, we had people who were doing ethnographies of particular football hooligan gangs in a contemporary way. I had a PhD student who looked at 3 particular football hooligan gangs, Leeds United, Portsmouth, and Brighton and Hove Albion. And that work was deliberately linked to the football hooligan memoir archive collection of 108 books, and also correspondence and in-depth interviews with publishers and authors. So the bunker anthropology idea is meant to be emphasising particular methods and particular methodologies.
But my question of you, and I'm particularly summoning our great colleague Umar Umangay when I discuss this, is why aren't you therefore looking at ethnography within the frame of sociology as a discipline, which of course has had a great life that you've just discussed, club culture, sport and so forth, when anthropology has, I'll say, quite a negative, quite a destructive history and heritage in terms of colonial peoples. So going into Asia, going into the African nations, and, studying people that are not yourself. So how are you handling the power differential that so much of the history of anthropology reveals?
Well, yes, I certainly accept that there are all kinds of political and colonial debates about anthropology, but I think the emphasis in anthropology is ethnographic, and I think that's what I was really interested in. I absolutely accept there's all sorts of difficulties with it, but I think in sociology, ethnography has basically become, an old method. I don't think it's a new method. And particularly in the sort of area I was talking about, the work that I've done, particularly in the area of football cultures, ethnography was relatively rare. People like Gary Armstrong's book on Sheffield United fans was done in the 90s, nearly 20 years ago, although it was an award-winning book and very important. And he's done work on ultras since then, for example, with other colleagues. Jeff Pearson's book on his 16-year ethnography on Blackpool, England and Manchester United fans. You're talking about relatively small areas of work going on. I mean, these are really important projects, I think, but it's not a method that has been particularly extensively used in, say, physical cultural studies, which is what I'm particularly interested in. So I'm trying to kind of excavate its origins and its histories and how we might move it forward. But I absolutely accept that there are all kinds of political and social debates around it, which we need to keep having.
And I'm going to push you on the method question, and I understand why you've become focused on the method issue, because obviously you and I, particularly in our last 2 years on our return to Australia, we've been working in more social scientific departments in some ways rather than the humanities, which has, I think, perhaps some more honesty and reflection in the methods that are deployed, particularly the engagement with the archive, unobtrusive research methods and so forth. But in our social scientific engagements in the last couple of years, we've seen some, I would argue, deeply problematic empirical, empiricist, positivist methods being deployed, where we've seen postgraduate students and staff, and I wish I was rareifying this, but talk to 3 people and assume that some sort of relevant truth is being configured there, rather than, it's that old notion of what is representative evidence, obviously, but the difference between evidence and illustration is not necessarily being discussed as overtly. So can I just push you a little bit more on the method? Bunker anthropology you're using as a method. Why is it a method, and what meta functionality can it hold in our discussion of methods in the social sciences and perhaps the humanities?
I absolutely agree with you that one of the reasons why I was so keen to start debates about methods and methodologies within this bunker anthropology project, particularly in the areas of the books that I've written recently, was because the positivism in social science has come back. And I think that's why I was so concerned to preserve, say, ethnography or all history or archive, because it seems to me that that's what we're doing. We're re-sciencing social science, and it's in a positivist direction, and I think there are real problems with that. So the bunker anthropology idea was a project aimed at empiricist and positivist methodologies. But I also think that methods and methodologies get mixed up here.
Indeed.
I think a lot of the problem is that at one time, philosophy of methodologies was really an important topic. It gets taught less and less within our universities, and you're absolutely right that there are real problems with kind of what are seen to be standard methodologies in various disciplines. It's just not very rigorous. For a start.
I mean, when in doubt, use a focus group, and yet the complexity of managing a focus group, and it's just not been handled well at all.
No, and I think that has been coming for the last 20 years, and it's connected to the if you like, the focus and the purpose of universities. Universities doing work, survey work, and consultancy work for the outside world. Particular methodologies have been used, and I think they've got bastardised, actually. I absolutely agree with you. But I think particularly what I was trying to do within what I call almost ironically bunker anthropology is to refocus our attention on certain methodologies and then certain methods, and try to work out, particularly in the work that I was doing in these most recent books, what's best. And I did find some of that quite useful.
Yeah, and also just to go back to Umar's critique, and a big hello to Umar. I know he's very involved in these podcasts, and the feedback he gives us is absolutely tremendous.
Absolutely.
But Umar's been developing a concept called decolonising the curriculum. I wonder if this is a way to decolonise methods. That could be something to think about.
Yeah.
And again, obviously, that's just a phrase I've thrown at you, but perhaps it's that meta functionality, noting the history of anthropology, that allows you to move that history forward and decolonise it.
Yes, I think so. And I mean, I'm very interested in what Umar's doing. He's really good. And I think there is some really interesting work in what I would say is methodology going on. But I think we lost somehow, in this perhaps last couple of decades, as universities did become more scientific in their orientation. A lot of social sciences and humanities departments really got lost, I think. And we're at a point where methodologies are now important again. So the kinds of questions Umar's raising can be put on the table again, which is great.
And that, of course, is why this Theoretical Times project was formed. Listeners may remember early on in this project, we said we are not apologising for doing theory.
No.
When we returned to Australia, there was very much, those people are doing theory.
Yep.
Well, yes, we are, and more people need to be.
Yep.
So Theoretical Times is about bringing back that theory without apologies.
Yes, and the point about claustropolitan sociology and bunker anthropology in my work is that the two need to go together.
Yes.
You can't separate.
Yes. Having said that, I'm just about to separate it for our last question, Steve, because I want to return once more to the bunker. And when I was doing the preparation for this podcast today, I was thinking through this problem. I'm sure listeners are as well. So I'm going to ask you and see if we can resolve it. So when we're thinking about the bunker, for you, is the bunker a trope, an image, a metaphor, or perhaps is it a theory in and of itself? What is the bunker?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to answer, which is why it's a really good question, and it's I think something that work can really go on around, and people are certainly picking up on aspects of that part of Aurelio's work, although they're also moving across that and into other things. It's quite an obscure part of his work in many ways, although I think he's quite proud of it.
Yeah.
I would say for me, why it's important is because of that kind of feeling of claustrophobia, which is what I think Virilio has it personally. But what I was trying to do in the work on claustropolitan sociology was to get this structure of feeling, this feeling of almost being hemmed in, wanting to get off the planet, that kind of thing. And the bunker also has this suggestion of closed in,
but also with a little bit more of that surveillance too.
Yes, I hadn't really thought about the surveillance part of it as much as you had.
You see, you are closed in,
yes,
but others are watching your closed-inness.
Yes.
So for me, this perhaps leads to what may be our next podcast, which is foreclosure.
Yes.
And so I see foreclosure as part of the bunker because it's about closure, but you're being watched in your desperation.
Yes, and foreclosure, I think, will be a really interesting concept that we'll look at, but that idea of being closed in, not being able to get out, we need somewhere to escape to, which is one of the things we've talked about in other aspects of this series. And I think the thing is that why I'm hesitant in some ways is that a lot of these bits of the work are really quite suggestive.
Yeah.
They're kind of half formulated. I'm sure listeners can hear that in my voice.
Productive too.
But that's good because the way forward, I think, is, as I said before, is a quite narrow theoretical ledge, which is also a bit bunker-like.
Yeah.
We're trying to grasp at a new global condition which is already in place, but we don't really recognise it as such. Things, certainly in a place like Western Australia, look pretty good. Beautiful place to live and to come and visit. But actually underneath it is what I've said before, Slavoj Žižek says, which is trouble in paradise. And this is a great example in Western Australia where the government debt is going through the floor and iron ore prices are going through the floor and so on. So watch this space. But I think there's it's the structure of feeling, suddenly things are going through the floor. And I think that is one of the confusions of this global condition, which I call claustropolitanism. And that's why the bunker, whether you use it as a metaphor, as a trope, or as an image, I think has some kind of purchase. I'm sure Virelli never thought about it when he was doing these photographs of the bunker, which he did, in the late 50s and early 1960s. I'm sure he didn't think of it in those terms, but he's got something there which we can still use. I
agree. And the one variable I would add that perhaps is useful to the work that you might be doing in future, Steve, is you've quoted a few times the Raymond Williams structure of feeling phrase, idea, which has transformed really cultural studies and affect theory. Audience studies was based on structure of feeling, if you like. But I wonder if bunker anthropology moves us beyond structure and structures of feeling to structures of fear and structures of vulnerability.
Yes.
And that then loops back to the post-colonial imperative within anthropology that this is about vulnerability. You study the other because whiteness is a site of fear. So you displace all the fears, the troubles, the issues of whiteness onto the other. Yeah. And I just wonder how the bunker operates there. So that's the one thing I would consider, because the bunker is built for protection, but it is also a site of vulnerability that is visible in the landscape and can be watched. So I think that ambivalence is going to be important.
Yeah, there's so much to think about there, and I have to go away and think about it.
But thank you very much for this provocative conversation. This is really interesting, powerful, disciplinary, methodological work that I think there's a lot there, and listeners will talk about this. Please give us feedback as much as you like. We always appreciate your comments, and I think this is moving us forward. So we've done our 2 discipline-based concepts, if you like, and the remainder of the series will take one word and particularly focus on the contexts in which we live. So, Steve, thank you for that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast on Theoretical Times by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.